Montana Territory, 1871. The unforgiving winter winds swept across the plains as Colton Campbell pulled his coat tighter around his lean frame. At 25, he had already seen more hardship than men twice his age. The frozen landscape before him matched the coldness he kept locked within his heart, a necessary shield in this merciless frontier. His ranch, little more than a humble cabin and small stable, stood as testimony to his solitary existence. Loneliness was the price of survival out here, he reminded himself, adjusting his worn Stetson against the biting cold. A man rides alone or he doesn't survive long, Colton muttered to his horse, a chestnut gelding named Buck who'd been his only constant companion for 3 years. The sentiment had become his mantra since losing his parents to typhoid and his older brother to a bandit's bullet. At 25, Colton had built walls higher than the distant mountains, convinced that attachments were dangerous liabilities in this untamed wilderness. His handsome features, strong jaw dusted with light stubble, piercing blue eyes, and sun-bronzed skin belied the weariness in his soul. Though young, the frontier had aged his spirit if not his appearance. Women in the nearest settlement of White Rock occasionally cast hopeful glances his way, but Colton maintained his distance, focused solely on building his small cattle operation and surviving season by season. The West takes more than it gives, he told himself, watching his breath crystallize in the frigid air, and loving someone just gives it more to take from you. 3 miles from his property, smoke rose from a homestead that hadn't been there last spring. Newcomers, he thought grimly, they wouldn't last the winter, they never did. The land was too harsh, the elements too cruel, the distance between neighbors too vast for the unprepared. He'd seen it before, families arriving with dreams of prosperity only to leave broken or in pine boxes. It wasn't his concern. He had enough trouble keeping himself and his small herd alive. Still, as the snow began to fall in earnest, Colton couldn't help glancing toward that distant wisp of smoke. Something about its persistence nagged at him. With a sigh of resignation, he turned Buck toward the homestead. Just to check, he told himself. Frontier courtesy, nothing more. The cabin came into view as the snowfall thickened, a modest structure with a partially completed barn beside it. Outside, a slender figure struggled against the weight of firewood, slipping in the fresh snow. Without thinking, Colton urged Buck forward, closing the distance quickly as he watched the young woman fall to her knees in the deepening snow. Zoe Parker looked up at the approaching rider, her breath catching. At 20 years old, she'd learned to be wary of strangers, especially lone men approaching the homestead when her father was away hunting. Her golden blonde hair whipped across her face in the wind, escaping from beneath her woolen bonnet. Despite the cold reddening her cheeks, her beauty was unmistakable, delicate features set in determination, bright green eyes narrowing as she assessed the approaching horseman. "Ma'am," Colton called, tipping his hat as he dismounted, "looks like you could use some assistance." "We manage just fine," she answered, struggling to her feet, her plain blue calico dress dusted with snow. "My father will be back by sundown." Colton nodded, understanding her caution. "Storm's picking up, that wood won't last you the night." He glanced at her meager pile. "I'm Colton Campbell, my ranch is 3 miles east. I can help you get properly stocked before this turns into a blizzard." Zoe hesitated, weighing her limited options against the howling wind that seemed to grow stronger by the minute. "Zoe Parker," she finally offered. "My father and I arrived from Ohio last spring." "First winter in Montana Territory," Colton observed, not a question but a statement tinged with concern. "It's different from back east." "We're learning that," she admitted, a flash of vulnerability crossing her features before her chin lifted again in stubborn pride. For the next hour, Colton worked silently, splitting and stacking enough wood to last through the storm. Zoe disappeared inside but returned with a steaming cup of coffee that she hesitantly offered him. "It's not much payment for your help," she said. Colton accepted the cup, their fingers briefly touching in the exchange. Something unexpected passed between them, a spark of connection that startled them both. He quickly stepped back, returning to the practiced emotional distance that had kept him safe for so long. "Where's your father hunting?" he asked, changing the subject. "Western Hills," she replied. "He should have returned by now." Colton looked toward the thickening wall of white obscuring the landscape. If her father was caught in this, his chances were slim. The thought of Zoe alone in this wilderness stirred something protective in him that he immediately tried to suppress. "I'll ride out and look for him," he said, draining the coffee. "You'll do no such thing," she countered. "This storm will bury you both." "I know these lands," he doesn't. Colton handed her the empty cup. "Bar your door." Keep the fire stoked. I'll be back with your father or not at all. The words hung between them, heavy with frontier pragmatism. Zoe's eyes widened slightly, revealing her fear not just for her father but, surprisingly, for this stranger who'd appeared like a ghost from the storm. Why would you risk yourself for people you don't know? She asked. Colton had no good answer that wouldn't contradict everything he believed about frontier survival. Because no one else will, he finally said, mounting Buck. That's how it is out here. As he rode away, Colton questioned his own judgment. This was exactly the kind of entanglement he'd sworn to avoid, other people's problems becoming his own. Yet something about Zoe Parker's quiet strength and the vulnerability she tried so hard to hide had pierced through his carefully constructed barriers. Hours later, with daylight fading and the temperature plummeting, Colton found Henry Parker struggling through knee-deep snow, a wounded deer carcass abandoned behind him. The older man was half-frozen, disoriented, and suspicious of the young cowboy who appeared through the swirling white. "My daughter," were Henry's first slurred words. "She's safe," Colton assured him, helping the man onto Buck. "But you won't be unless we find shelter fast." The journey back was treacherous, visibility reduced to mere feet ahead. Buck stumbled through drifts while Colton walked alongside, one hand on the reins, the other supporting Henry in the saddle. When they finally glimpsed the faint glow of the Parker homestead, Colton felt a relief that startled him with its intensity. Zoe rushed out at their approach, her eyes red from worried tears. "Father," she cried, helping Colton bring the older man inside. The small cabin was warm, the fire Colton had supplied wood for burning steadily. As they worked together to warm Henry and treat his early stages of frostbite, Colton found himself acutely aware of Zoe's movements, her gentle hands, her soft voice as she comforted her father, her determined efficiency as she prepared hot broth. "The storm's too fierce to leave tonight," she said later, after Henry had fallen into an exhausted sleep. "You'll stay." It wasn't a question, and Colton found himself nodding despite knowing he should attempt the ride back. The thought of his own cold, empty cabin suddenly seemed less appealing than this modest home filled with the warmth of human connection. "Just until morning," he agreed, settling into a chair by the fire. "Then I'll be on my way." But morning brought 3 feet of snow and winds that still howled like banshees around the cabin corners. Colton found himself trapped with the Parkers for 3 days, during which time he learned more about human companionship than he had in years of solitude. He discovered that Zoe had lost her mother and brothers to scarlet fever 2 years earlier, that Henry had been a schoolteacher in Ohio before deciding to seek a new start in the West, and that Zoe could recite poetry that made the cramped cabin seem larger somehow, filled with images of places Colton had never seen. Most disturbing to his carefully maintained worldview, he discovered that Zoe's smile could warm him more effectively than the fire, and that helping the Parkers prepare for the winter ahead gave him a satisfaction he hadn't experienced since his family was alive. When the storm finally broke and Colton prepared to leave, something had shifted inside him, a crack in the foundation of his belief that isolation was the only safe way to navigate the frontier. "You'll come back?" Zoe asked as he mounted Buck, her question catching him off guard. Colton hesitated. "To check on your preparations for winter," he finally said, framing it as practical frontier concern rather than the personal connection he felt growing. "You still need to finish that barn before the next storm." "We'd welcome the help," Henry said, extending his hand, "and the company." As Colton rode away, he fought the urge to look back, to see if Zoe was still watching him go. His mind raced with conflicting thoughts, the danger of caring for others in this harsh land versus the unexpected comfort he'd found in their cabin. Over the weeks that followed, Colton found himself riding to the Parker homestead with increasing frequency. Each visit was justified with practical reasons, helping repair the roof, bringing extra supplies from town, teaching Henry about local hunting grounds. But the truth, which Colton struggled to deny, was that he came for Zoe's smile, for her stories by the fire, for the way she looked at him as if he were more than just a hardened survivor of the frontier. As autumn faded toward winter, Colton and Henry worked to complete the barn while Zoe preserved the last garden harvest. Their conversation flowed easier now, punctuated by moments of laughter that would have seemed foreign to Colton months earlier. "You're different from other men I've known," Zoe said one afternoon as they worked side by side, sorting potatoes for storage. "How so?" Colton asked, suddenly self-conscious. "You listen," she replied simply. "To the land, to animals, to people, you hear what isn't being said." Her observation unsettled him, not because it was untrue, but because it suggested she had been watching him as closely as he'd been watching her. That evening, as Colton prepared to ride home, Zoe walked him to where Buck waited. The first stars were appearing in the clear sky, and the air held the sharp promise of winter. "There's a social gathering in White Rock next Saturday," she said, her eyes on the distant horizon rather than meeting his. "Father thinks we should attend, meet our neighbors properly before winter isolates us all." Colton tensed. Town gatherings weren't part of his routine. They meant people, questions, expectations, all things he'd avoided for years. "Will you be there?" she asked when he remained silent. "I don't usually," he began. "I'd feel safer with someone I know," she interrupted, finally looking at him directly. "Someone who knows this territory and its people." Her request, framed as practical concern, was transparent to them both. Something more was being asked, something that terrified and tempted Colton in equal measure. "I'll consider it," he said finally, mounting Buck and riding away before she could see the conflict in his eyes. For days afterward, Colton argued with himself about the social. Attending meant publicly acknowledging a connection to the Parkers. It meant stepping back into community life he'd abandoned after his family's deaths. Most frighteningly, it meant confronting the growing feelings for Zoe that threatened his carefully constructed philosophy of frontier survival. Saturday arrived with Colton still undecided, pacing his cabin until Buck nickered impatiently from the corral. With a muttered curse, Colton pulled out the one decent shirt he owned, shaved his stubble and rode toward town, telling himself he was just going to check on supplies, not to attend any gathering. The White Rock meeting hall was lit with lanterns when he arrived, fiddle music spilling into the street. Colton sat atop Buck for long minutes, watching shadows move across the windows, listening to laughter and conversation, sounds of community that both attracted and repelled him. He was about to turn away when he spotted Zoe and Henry approaching the hall. She wore a dress he hadn't seen before, deep green that matched her eyes, her golden hair pinned up more formally than usual. Something tightened in Colton's chest at the sight, a mixture of admiration and fear that left him momentarily breathless. Before he could retreat, Zoe glanced up and saw him. Her face brightened with a smile of such genuine pleasure that Colton found himself dismounting and securing Buck to the hitching post almost against his will. "You came," she said when he approached, her voice warm with surprise. "Just passing through," he lied unconvincingly. Henry clapped him on the shoulder. "Well, you're here now, might as well come in where it's warm." Inside, the social was in full swing. Farmers, ranchers, and townspeople mingling in a rare moment of frontier celebration before winter's isolation. Colton felt immediately exposed, uncomfortable with the curious glances and nods of recognition. Colton Campbell, called Jim Mercer, the general store owner. "Haven't seen you at a gathering in 3 years?" "About that," Colton acknowledged stiffly. "Heard you've been helping the Parkers get settled," Jim continued, his eyes twinkling with unsubtle interest as he glanced between Colton and Zoe. "Good of you, they're fine additions to our community." More comments followed as others recognized his presence. Colton felt the walls closing in, his carefully maintained distance from White Rock's residents crumbling with each greeting and question. Just as he was considering a hasty exit, the fiddler struck up a livelier tune and people began clearing space for dancing. "Dance with me," Zoe said beside him, not quite a question. Colton started to refuse, to explain that he hadn't danced since before his family died, that he didn't remember how, that he needed to leave. But the hopeful light in her eyes stopped the words in his throat. "I'm not much of a dancer," he warned. "Neither am I," she admitted with a small laugh. "Father says I have 2 left feet, we can be terrible together." That unexpected confession, her willingness to show imperfection, disarmed him completely. Colton found himself nodding, allowing her to lead him into the circle of dancers. Their first attempts were awkward, with stepped-on toes and missed turns, but soon they found a rhythm together, moving in surprising harmony across the wooden floor. When Zoe laughed at their occasional stumbles, Colton found himself smiling, then chuckling, then laughing alongside her, a sound so foreign to his ears that he barely recognized it as his own. By the end of the evening, something fundamental had shifted. Colton had spoken with neighbors he'd avoided for years, shared a meal at a community table, and danced not just with Zoe but with other young women when propriety demanded partners be exchanged. Most significantly, he had experienced joy without the immediate shadow of guilt or fear following it. As he escorted the Parkers home under a canopy of stars, Colton felt both exhilarated and terrified by how easily he had slipped back into human connection. The walls he'd built were crumbling, and he wasn't certain he could or wanted to rebuild them. "Will you come for Sunday dinner tomorrow?" Henry asked as they reached the Parker homestead. "Zoe makes a fine rabbit stew." "I should check my herd," Colton began automatically, the old excuse ready on his lips. "Your cattle will survive one afternoon without you," Henry countered good-naturedly. "A man needs more than work to sustain him." Colton glanced at Zoe, who watched him with quiet hope. "I suppose they will," he conceded. "Thank you for the invitation." That night, alone in his cabin, Colton confronted the truth he'd been avoiding. Zoe Parker had awakened something in him he thought long dead, the desire for companionship, for shared moments, for a future that included more than mere survival. The realization terrified him. To care was to become vulnerable again, to open himself to the devastating loss he'd experienced before. "The frontier takes what you love," he reminded himself aloud. "That's the one certainty out here." Yet when he closed his eyes, it was Zoe's face he saw, her determination, her resilience, her unexpected joy in small things. She too had suffered loss, had journeyed into this harsh territory knowing its dangers. But unlike him, she hadn't surrendered to isolation as protection. The following day brought Colton back to the Parker homestead for dinner, the first of many such visits as winter descended in earnest across the Montana territory. December arrived with bitter cold, yet Colton found himself riding through snowdrifts regularly to check on the Parkers, to bring supplies, to sit by their fire and listen to Zoe read from one of the precious books they'd brought from Ohio. Christmas approached, and with it came news of trouble. Jim Mercer stopped Colton outside the general store one frigid afternoon. "Heard there's a gang moving through the territory," the storekeeper said, voice low. "3 men robbed the stage near Helena last week. Killed the driver." Colton felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December wind. "Any descriptions?" "One's supposed to be tall with a scar across his face. They're working their way south, hitting isolated homesteads." "Thought you should know, what with your place being remote and all." Jim paused, then added meaningfully, "and the Parkers being even more so." Colton rode immediately to warn Henry and Zoe, finding them preparing their modest Christmas celebrations. The news cast a shadow over their plans, but Henry maintained his optimism. "We've faced hardships before," the older man said. "We'll be vigilant but not fearful." Colton wasn't satisfied. "You should come stay at my ranch until this passes," he insisted. "It's more defensible and with the 3 of us together." "We can't abandon our home, not after all the work we've put in," Henry interrupted gently. "But we appreciate your concern, Colton." Zoe walked Colton outside as he prepared to leave, snow crunching beneath their boots. "He's too proud to admit we might be vulnerable," she said softly. "But I'm worried too." Colton stopped, turning to face her. "I'll check on you daily," he promised, "more often if the weather allows." "You can't risk yourself constantly for us," she protested. "You have your own ranch to manage." "I'm not risking myself for just anyone," he replied, the words emerging before he could stop them. In the fading winter light, with snowflakes catching in her golden hair, Zoe looked at him with an expression that made his heart twist painfully in his chest. "Colton," she whispered, stepping closer. He should have maintained distance, should have mounted Buck and ridden away. Instead, Colton found himself reaching for her, drawing her gently toward him. Their first kiss was tentative, soft as the snowfall around them, yet it shattered the last of his resistance. When they parted, Colton saw his own wonder reflected in Zoe's eyes. "I didn't come west looking for this," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "Neither did I," he confessed. "I was content with solitude, or thought I was." "And now?" she asked. Colton took a breath, the cold air sharp in his lungs. "Now I'm afraid," he said honestly. "Not of outlaws or winter, but of how much I've come to care for you. Out here, caring for someone is dangerous." "More dangerous than being alone," she challenged. "Than facing everything without someone beside you." Her question followed him home, echoing through his thoughts as he secured his cabin for the night. For years, he'd believed isolation was safety, that emotional distance protected him from the frontier's cruelty. Yet in just months, Zoe had made him question everything. 2 days before Christmas, a heavy snowfall kept Colton from visiting the Parkers. He paced his cabin anxiously, watching the weather for signs of clearing. By evening, his concern had grown to alarm when he spotted distant firelight reflecting off the clouds in the direction of their homestead, too bright, too large to be merely lamps or their hearth. Without hesitation, Colton armed himself, mounted Buck, and rode into the storm, fear driving him forward through drifts that threatened to halt their progress. As he crested the final rise, his worst fears were confirmed. The Parker barn was ablaze, lighting the night sky with terrible brightness. 3 horses stood outside the cabin, belonging to neither Colton nor the Parkers. The gang Jim had warned about had found their isolated target. Colton approached cautiously, tying Buck out of sight and moving forward on foot. Through the cabin window, he could see 3 men inside, one tall with a distinctive facial scar, matching the description he'd been given. Henry sat at the table, blood trickling from a cut above his eye, while Zoe stood backed against the wall, her expression defiant despite the fear visible in her posture. Cold calculation replaced panic in Colton's mind. 3 armed men against one, with hostages in close quarters. The odds were grim, but he had surprise on his side and intimate knowledge of the surroundings. Moving to the back of the cabin, Colton found the small window to the storage room unguarded. He slipped inside silently, hearing the outlaws' voices more clearly now. "Just tell us where you keep your money, old man, and maybe we'll leave your pretty daughter alone," the scarred man was saying. "We've told you everything," Henry replied, his voice strained but steady. "We're homesteaders, not bankers. What you see is all we have." "Nobody comes to this godforsaken territory without a stake," another outlaw argued. "You're lying." "Search all you want," Zoe said, her voice cutting through the tension. "You'll find nothing because there is nothing to find." A slap resounded through the cabin, followed by Henry's shout of anger and the sound of a struggle. Colton moved without further hesitation, emerging from the storage room with his revolver drawn. "Step away from them," he commanded, his voice cold as the winter night outside. The outlaws froze momentarily, then the scarred leader smiled slowly. "Well now, what have we here? The cavalry's arrived, boys." "I won't ask again," Colton said, his finger steady on the trigger. What followed happened in a blur of violence. The scarred man reached for his gun, Henry lunged across the table to protect Zoe, and Colton fired. The leader fell, but his companions returned fire, sending Colton diving for cover as splinters flew from the wooden walls. In the chaos, Zoe grabbed her father's hunting rifle from its rack and joined the fight, her hands remarkably steady as she aimed and fired at one of the remaining outlaws. Henry, though injured, managed to knock the 3rd man off balance with a chair. When the smoke cleared, 2 outlaws lay dead, the 3rd wounded and subdued. Colton's left arm bled from a graze, but his focus was entirely on Zoe and Henry, checking them frantically for serious injuries. "You're hurt," Zoe said, reaching for Colton's arm. "It's nothing," he dismissed, still scanning them both. "Are you, did they?" "We're all right," Henry assured him, though blood still trickled from his temple. "Thanks to you arriving when you did." Outside, the barn continued to burn, the crackling of flames mixing with the howling wind. "We need to secure this one and get that fire under control before it spreads to the cabin," Colton said, indicating the surviving outlaw. For hours they worked together, binding the wounded man, battling the fire with snow and what water they could carry, treating each other's injuries. By dawn, exhaustion had claimed them all, but the immediate dangers had passed. As the sun rose on the snow-covered landscape, Colton stood with Zoe outside the cabin, surveying the blackened remains of the barn they'd worked so hard to build. "We can rebuild it," she said quietly. "Come spring." Colton turned to look at her, really look at her. This young woman who had faced armed outlaws with courage, who had helped save them all, who stood now looking at destruction not with despair but with determination to begin again. "I thought I was coming to rescue you," he admitted. "But you didn't need rescuing, you're stronger than I ever gave you credit for." "Everyone needs help sometimes," Zoe replied, taking his hand, "even the strongest." "That's what I've been trying to show you, Colton. Out here, alone isn't stronger, together is stronger." Her words struck him with the force of revelation. For years, he'd believed his isolation was wisdom, was survival. But faced with real danger, it was connection, to Zoe, to Henry, to community, that had made the difference. "I've been a fool," he said softly, "thinking I was protecting myself by staying alone. All I did was ensure that when trouble came, I'd face it without anyone beside me." "You're not alone anymore," Zoe said. "Not unless you choose to be." In that moment, with dawn breaking over the Montana wilderness, Colton made his choice. He pulled Zoe gently into his arms, mindful of both their injuries, and kissed her with all the emotion he'd spent years suppressing. "I love you," he said when they parted, the words both foreign and inevitable on his lips. I think I have since that first snowstorm when you offered me coffee and questioned why I'd help strangers. Tears filled Zoe's eyes, but her smile was radiant. I've loved you since you rode out into that same storm to find my father, risking yourself for our family when you barely knew us. 2 days later, Christmas arrived with cleared skies but bitter cold. With the Parker barn destroyed, Colton insisted they move temporarily to his ranch until repairs could be made. The wounded outlaw had been transported to White Rock for medical attention and eventual justice, accompanied by Jim Mercer and several townsmen who'd ridden out after hearing gunshots. Word of the attack and of how the Parkers and Colton had defended themselves spread quickly through the scattered community. On Christmas morning, wagons began arriving at Colton's ranch bearing food, gifts, and offers of help with rebuilding come spring. "Seems you're not as disconnected from this community as you thought," Henry observed as Colton stared in amazement at their unexpected visitors. For the first time in years, Colton's cabin was filled with voices, laughter, and the warmth of human connection. As he watched Zoe move among their neighbors, accepting condolences about the barn and thanks for helping eliminate the outlaw threat, he felt the last of his resistance crumble. That evening, after their guests had departed, Colton found himself alone with Zoe by the fireplace. Henry had retired early, exhausted from the day's activities and still recovering from his injuries. "I have something for you," Colton said, retrieving a small package from his coat. "It isn't much." Zoe unwrapped the simple gift, a carved wooden pendant on a leather cord, shaped like a mountain flower that bloomed briefly each spring. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Did you make this?" Colton nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "I started it weeks ago after the social. I wasn't even sure I'd give it to you." "Why not?" she asked, turning the pendant in her fingers. "Because giving gifts means acknowledging feelings," he admitted, "something I've avoided for a long time." Zoe smiled, slipping the cord over her head so the pendant rested against her heart. "I have something for you too," she said, retrieving a package of her own. Inside, Colton found a knitted scarf in deep blue wool. "I noticed your old one was fraying," she explained. "I've been working on this whenever you weren't visiting." The simple practicality of her gift, combined with the knowledge that she'd thought of him during their separations, moved Colton deeply. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "There's something else I want to give you," Zoe continued, her expression turning serious. "Something less tangible but more important." "What's that?" he asked. "A future," she said simply, "not just survival but a life." "Together." Colton's heart thundered in his chest. "Are you proposing to me, Zoe Parker?" he asked, attempting humor to mask how deeply her words affected him. "I'm proposing that we stop pretending we're meant for separate paths," she clarified, moving closer. "I'm proposing that the ranch you've built alone and the homestead we're rebuilding could become one home, one future." In her green eyes, Colton saw everything he'd convinced himself he couldn't have on the frontier: partnership, family, love that didn't weaken but strengthened. The final walls around his heart collapsed completely. "I've spent years believing the frontier only takes," he said, taking her hands in his. "But you've shown me it can give too, if we're brave enough to accept it." Spring arrived with renewal, both literal and symbolic. The Parker barn rose again, larger and stronger than before, built by hands from across the community. Colton's cattle herd merged with the Parkers' small flock of sheep, grazing together on combined pasture lands. Most significantly, on a clear April morning, Zoe Parker became Zoe Campbell in a ceremony attended by nearly everyone from White Rock. "Never thought I'd see the day," Jim Mercer commented at the celebration afterward. Colton Campbell, the territory's most determined loner, taking a bride. "She didn't give me much choice," Colton replied with a smile, watching Zoe dance with her father. "Turns out surviving alone isn't the same as living." As summer bloomed across the Montana landscape, the combined Campbell-Parker ranch flourished. Henry's knowledge of crops complemented Colton's skill with livestock, while Zoe's determined spirit and practical intelligence bound their operation together. The cabin that had once echoed with Colton's solitary footsteps now rang with conversation, occasional arguments, and frequent laughter. When autumn painted the distant mountains with gold and crimson, Zoe shared news that completed Colton's transformation from isolated survivor to man embedded in life's full cycle. They would welcome a child with the spring thaw. That night, standing under stars that no longer seemed cold and distant, but part of the canopy sheltering their shared life, Colton reflected on the journey that had brought him here. The frontier remained harsh, unforgiving in its demands and dangers. But he faced it now not alone but alongside others, strengthened rather than weakened by the bonds between them. "What are you thinking about?" Zoe asked, joining him outside, her hand resting on the slight swell of her belly. "About how wrong I was," he answered honestly. "For years I thought caring for others was a liability out here, that to survive the frontier a man had to stand alone." "And now," she prompted, leaning against his shoulder. Colton wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close against the evening chill. "Now I understand that the frontier doesn't just test our ability to endure hardship, it tests our capacity for connection despite that hardship. Alone we survive, together we live." Zoe smiled up at him, her face illuminated by the rising moon. "Together," she agreed, "we face whatever comes." And as they stood there, the vast Montana wilderness surrounding them no longer seemed a threat to be defended against but a challenge to be met side by side. Their love not a vulnerability, but their greatest strength against whatever storms the frontier might still bring.